Welcome to the Thinking Legal podcast with me, David Kerner. This is a podcast about the human and psychological aspects of the legal sector. I run The Marketing Legal, a legal marketing agency, and you can find us at www.themarketinglegal.com. I hope you enjoy the show. Today, I'm joined by Matt Campobasso, who's General Counsel of New York-listed investment management software company Enfusion. Matt, thank you for joining me.
David, absolute pleasure to be here. I recently came upon your podcast on LinkedIn, and obviously for reasons I'm sure we'll get into here, my interest was immediately piqued, and I reached out and we had a nice chat, and I'm just really happy to be here. I'm looking forward to spending some time together.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to speaking to you. And we were talking before the recording, and we decided to talk about what makes an effective lawyer. And a good way to talk about this is through your own experience and your own career. So you've had a bit of an interesting journey to where you are. So let's start by talking about your early career into law and also your degrees.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think, given the title of this podcast, Thinking Legal, I think that it probably is a good starting point to talk about my undergraduate degree. So I attended the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, and University of Illinois is about 3 hours south. Has a wonderful reputation academically and a really great psychology program. I was one of those lost souls in high school and even early in my college career that wasn't sure what he wanted to do for a living. I had interests and things that I was drawn to, but when I got to U of I started thinking about a future path, and I wasn't thinking about law school. I wasn't thinking about my current type of role or anything like that. I just always found myself fascinated by human behavior and the way that the human mind works. So I jumped headfirst into a major degree in psychology. I took, every psychology class that they offered, and it was fascinating. And it was this like insatiable need to understand, children, adults, relationships, criminals. And like I said, I lived and breathed psychology for my whole college career. And then obviously, reality came knocking towards graduation and said, hey, you got to go do something with this. And I didn't know what to do. My uncle, who's also my godfather, is an attorney. I always kind of thought about going into that field, but I wasn't sure. And I started to think about, how do I utilize my toolkit from being a psychology undergraduate if I want to go be a lawyer? And I had some thoughts about that and some conversations with people I know that were lawyers and that had psychology backgrounds. And I thought, you know what? All of law, from what I understood at that point in my career, was about, advocating and convincing people of things or understanding people's behavior. And we can kind of talk about how I've utilized that in my career along the way. But it was enough for me to decide, you know what, I'm going to give law school a go. And I did. I attended University of Illinois at Chicago Law School. I graduated in 2006. And yeah, I've been practicing for 18 years. And I've had a number of stops in my career, and I have found my psychology degree to prove valuable in different ways in each of them.
Excellent. And let's start off by talking about your career as a prosecutor and then a litigator. So in terms of the human insights that you gained there and the techniques that you learned, maybe you could take us through both of those.
Absolutely. So, there's some common threads that run through my time as a criminal prosecutor and my time as a litigator, but I also think about them conceptually very differently. And I think my education, my higher education in psychology proved valuable in each of those roles quite differently. So talking about being a criminal prosecutor, I did that job for almost 2 years at the state level in Illinois. And, I was responsible over the course of my career for thousands of cases. I tried hundreds of cases. And anytime I was handed a file, let's say there was a battery, right? Someone approach somebody at a restaurant or a bar and they punch them. The person who threw the punch gets arrested for battery. There's a charge, there's a victim, a police officer comes, writes up a report. Well, when the time comes to go to court as the state, which I represented, you have to bring in a witness. And when there's a crime with a victim, the best witness is that victim, because they're going to say, this person punched me. And so what I found was, I had to really meet each of these victims kind of where they were mentally and emotionally, because I more than once, David, I had somebody tell me, why are you making me do this? I already had to live through it once. And I had to say, look, you know, I had to kind of explain to them how our criminal justice system is built and that there's a burden on the state. But I had to get them comfortable with the fact that, like, look, you're going to have to relive this a second time. The first time, you were purely a victim of circumstance. Somebody else decided to break the law and you were a victim of that. This time, while you are a quote unquote victim in the grand scheme of this case, you actually have a voice here and you have an opportunity to make sure that there are consequences for this person having done what they did. And, anybody who's listening who has took a psychology 101 class can understand the sort of human thinking element that runs through those conversations. And so, I had colleagues who were really good trial lawyers, very technical, but when it came to victims, they would not know how to communicate with them. They wouldn't know how to get them to understand, like, look, this isn't a punitive thing. It's actually something we're trying to do to make sure the system works the right way. And so, empathy, an understanding of fear, an understanding of trauma, for every bar fight that I had, there was a domestic abuse case. There was cruelty to animals. There was cruelty to children. There was kidnapping. There was attempted murder. And so, the more severe the crime, the more the victim is like, I don't want to get back in here and deal with this again. Like, I want to go on live with my life. I don't want to relive this. And so my psychology degree, I felt, really helped me understand and be optimally empathetic to help victims get comfortable with the fact that, listen, for this system to work the right way, you've got to kind of set down this preconceived notion that this is a punishment to you and realize you have an opportunity here to be a voice for other victims. So that would be one really, I think, acute example of how my psychology degree provided valuable as a prosecutor. Same thing with litigation. It wasn't, when you're talking about litigation, you don't have the state and the defendant. You have a plaintiff and a defendant. It's a breach of contract. It's a fraud. But look, on the other end of it is lots and lots of money, right? And people who have built businesses and people who are executives and people, anytime there's a dispute or conflict, there's fear, right? And people, when they are fearful, I feel like logic goes out the window a lot and they fail to see kind of how this looks long term. And so people like to bury their heads in the sand. And I think as a litigator, something I was effective at and able to do, which helped me, was to understand and put myself in the headspace that these individuals were in. A CEO, a general counsel at a company, a small business owner, a former executive who was terminated. And to say, look, like, I understand you're fearful. There's a process here. Their emotion plus, I think, my logic, is how the client attorney relationship works. And I think it's helpful. Somebody who's in the middle of a lawsuit being sued for $10 million isn't going to be thinking very logically, most likely, right? They're going to be scared. They're going to be thinking, this is financial ruin. So my job is to say, hey, I'll be the logical one. I'll be the analytical one. I will be the one who thinks about this strategically. But you can have two great people in a conversation like that. They have to be able to connect. And I think for me as a litigator, it was easier to go to where they were emotionally than to expect them to come where I was logically. And so I found myself really leaning to their side of the table to counsel them as clients, not just hey, this is a business transaction, you're paying me hourly. But look, you are here in a time of need in your life. Either somebody did something and you're trying to get, recourse, or somebody thinks you did something and we're trying to figure out how to protect you and make this situation end the best possible way that it can. So again, an understanding of how the human brain works and a willingness, every single person, David, I mean, this, anybody knows this, the way they think about things is different. And so a big part of my practice as a litigator was getting to know my clients well, what drove them, what were their fears, what were their motivations, and then helping frame and provide counsel and guidance in a way that was digestible by them and actionable, where they could make decisions, more broadly. So, it's funny. I think when I went from a psychology degree to a law degree, a lot of people said, I'm not sure I understand the connection. And quite frankly, I don't know that I understood the connection. But what I will tell you is where I have gotten feedback from clients or victims or colleagues of mine in my career, and they've been very positive, feedback or glowing reviews. one of the big things that I've had emphasized to me is you really seem to understand how people think. And as a result, it makes you effective. And again, all of that goes back to my psychology degree. So while that was not all by design, it has worked out okay. And obviously, I'm very grateful for that.
Yes, indeed. And one of the things I got from that it wasn't you weren't intentionally implementing these strategies. This was something that almost came naturally to you, and you were acting on.
Yeah, I think it was more subconscious. It was just like I learned this stuff, and that's life, right? You pick up experiences along the way, you build out who your personality is and your characteristics. Yeah, I don't know that I ever thought like, hey, you know what? I'm going to really utilize my psychology degree today. Like I said, I think I got that education. I really jumped in head first, and it has just been something that I have found myself drawing upon more and more frequently, much more than I ever thought I would. Because I quite honestly thought when I went to law school, well, I so much for that psychology degree, but I obviously was wrong.
And obviously now you're general counsel at Enfusion. That's a bit of a jump from litigation and being a prosecutor. How did you make that jump?
Yeah, it was not one big jump. It was a lot of, I think, little hops. I anybody who has spent any time with me talking about that trajectory, if they're listening, I apologize. You're going to hear me say something I've said repeatedly, but it's important. I think as a litigator, I found myself cleaning up messes a lot, and it wasn't the most rewarding thing. Now, that's no offense to people who litigate. It's a necessary part of our legal system around the world. But for me, it just wasn't really kind of filling my cup. And so I thought, I want to take the skills I have and apply them in a different way that's maybe more rewarding for me. And people I knew were like, you should go be an in-house attorney because you're getting closer to those decisions that sometimes turn into litigation. So you have a more active hand in potentially preventing them from doing so. And so I went to a small company. Well, it's not small, but a mid-sized company called Elevate back in 2018. I had decided to leave the law firm I had been with as a partner. People who knew that I was leaving thought I was crazy because they said, "Hey, you just became partner. Like, isn't this what it was all about?" And yeah, I mean, there were days where I had some doubts as well, but I felt like, you know what, if there's a better way to do what I like doing, I want to explore that. So I went to Elevate. I had some experiences there in house, and I realized, you know what, getting closer to the business decisions on a day-to-day basis allows me to have a voice in those conversations and potentially help pull the company out from in front of a bus that's coming, maybe in the form of a lawsuit or a dispute. And after I left that company, I went to a small company that was private. I was their general counsel for a time. They were acquired by IBM. And rather than go join IBM, I elected to join Enfusion back in September of 2020. So that's kind of the like resume line by line how I made the jump. But really, what I ended up doing, David, is I stopped and I asked myself, am I doing this? Am I being a lawyer in the best possible sense? And I didn't feel like I was. And so, again, there are people who were born to be litigators. I worked with many of them. They will litigate until somebody puts them in a grave. And they're way better at it than I ever was. I felt like my particular skill set lent itself to working with people more closely about making sound decisions and being proactive. And again, with part of that transition was working with a lot of non-lawyers, rather than having 5 clients or 10 victims, I work at a company with 1,000 people plus there's 9 lawyers. Any given week I interact with 100 different people on 100 different things. And it's constantly requiring me again to understand how each of those people thinks about the world and to find effective ways to communicate with them and add value. So
Absolutely, and that brings me on to the next question. And we've covered empathy, and so let's talk a bit about empathy and emotional intelligence in your current role as a general counsel. How does that interact with your kind of day-to-day work?
I think they're both very important. And I know empathy and EQ are oftentimes kind of conflated. I know they're obviously different concepts, but from an empathy perspective, I think I tend to go into every situation assuming the person I'm working with is trying to get to the best possible outcome for themselves, for the company. And so when somebody comes to me, it's funny, I got it. This is as a quick aside. I was having quite a day a couple of years ago, and I said to a colleague of mine, why is it every time someone comes to me, it's with a problem? And they said, you're a lawyer. Like, that's your job, is to solve problems. And I said, you know what? Actually, you're right. Like, I felt kind of foolish not having considered that. But what I've realized is now when somebody comes to me, it's because they're in need, right? It may not be an end the world, end the company type need, but it could be, hey, I'm trying to get through my day. I bumped into something. Can you help me navigate this area that I don't know much about? And so I try to look at every encounter I have professionally and personally through the eyes of the person I'm having that conversation with, because understanding how they're viewing it is very helpful in understanding how to effectively communicate to them. And so rather than have a reaction of, why are you bothering me? Or you haven't thought about this the right way, that's never productive, right? People get defensive and then it actually takes you further away from a solution. So from an empathy perspective, I'm not perfect, but I would say I'm getting better every day at putting myself in the shoes of the people that I work with more immediately. And to me, that's helping us get to a point where I can very effectively add value more quickly. And efficiency is key, right? My day is filled with things. So, then to the second part of your question about emotional intelligence, that to me it's obviously a very closely related concept, but I think being able to understand, there's intelligence, which is great. It's funny, growing up, my dad, he would always say to me, there's two kinds of smarts. There's book smarts and there's street smarts. And anybody who has a library card can get book smarts. Street smarts are something you have to learn. You actually almost have to feel the pain of lessons, right? You have to go out there in the world and fall on your face and say, hey, when I do this, I'm going to fall on my face and it's going to hurt. That's where street smarts come from, trial and error, making mistakes. And so early on in my life, my dad was like, look, most people have some level of book smarts. It's the people who have street smarts that are going to be the ones who differentiate themselves in the world, professionally, personally. I think I have street smarts. And the reason why I'm emphasizing street smarts is because I think street smarts is not cunning. It's not, being Machiavellian. It's actually having emotional intelligence. It's being able to understand how the world works and how people make decisions and what motivates and drives people. And so when I go into a situation, one of the first things I do from an emotional intelligence perspective is if somebody comes to me with a request that has me kind of raising an eyebrow and tilting my head and thinking, I don't even understand why you would want this. I immediately try to step back and understand what's driving them down this path. And so I put myself in their shoes. Again, that's empathy to a degree, but empathy is feeling those emotions. Emotional intelligence is thinking about the person you're speaking with or working with from an emotional perspective rather than from a practical one. And so for me, generally I'll start with why. It's a great book on leadership called Start With Why. I'm sure you've heard it. I'm sure listeners to the podcast have heard it or read it. And really what it is, it's just about getting to the root cause. And I think trying to understand why people are the way they are emotionally and how they make decisions is like a superpower. And it's a key that I felt has unlocked a lot of very difficult situations that I found myself in as a lawyer.
Absolutely. And that brings us on to talking about a part of every lawyer's job, and especially a general counsel, and that's talking about crisis. And as you say, people come to you with problems. Can you share kind of instances where your kind of understanding of human behavior has been let's say pivotal in managing a crisis?
Absolutely. I'm trying to think of a way to kind of scrub the story so I'm not divulging anything privileged. That's the thing about being a lawyer. You know what? You have stories. As a lawyer who was a litigator, a trial lawyer for 13 years, I love storytelling. Anyone who knows me can say that. The problem is, when a good storyteller uses details, but a good lawyer keeps those details confidential. So yes. It's a constant battle, David. So I'm some days I win, some days I lose. One example I can give is back in my law firm days, we had made a filing in a case, and it was myself as a senior associate, a partner, and a junior associate. And the junior associate had done something not great, not unlawful or unethical, but had really made a pretty significant mistake. And we filed something, and it was likely going to harm our client. And when the partner found out, they were incredibly upset. The associate, who I knew to be a very thoughtful, intelligent, caring person, was besides themselves. And I thought, okay, there's two things I need to do here. Number one is make sure the client is protected. So we contacted the clerk. Thankfully, we had filed early. We withdrew our filing. We amended it. We refiled it. In parallel, and actually it was 4th of July weekend, so we're coming up on the time of year this happened. This was 10 years ago. The partner was livid, and rightfully so. It was not a great showing by this young lawyer. The young lawyer was terrified. And what I basically did is I kind of inserted myself in the middle, and I got the partner feeling calm, thinking, hey, we're going to withdraw this and we'll refile it and we'll amend it. And I'll send a note to the client, explain to them what happened. It's not a good look for the firm, but there's no long-term damage here. And then that partner, his focus was on this junior lawyer. And so I very quickly stepped in between that. And then I turned my focus to that junior lawyer. And we had some conversations about, number one, we're a team. Number two, I've got your back. Number three, reinforcing, hey, you're a smart person. I don't want this to shatter your confidence. Number four, look, to my point about street smarts earlier, David. And again, I've used that example that my dad and I had a conversation about repeatedly. I said, look, this is how you learn. You make mistakes. No one's perfect. If you're not making mistakes, you're not doing your job, because that means you're playing it safe. And as a lawyer specifically, yeah, a very conservative lawyer can say no all the time. But guess what? That's not going to help a company grow and evolve. You need to be proactive, and you need to say, hey, look, risk is opportunity, but we need to be thoughtful about it. So in that instance, it was very people focused, because we had a client who was upset. We had a partner who was very angry. And we had a junior lawyer who I felt like was at a position where it could have really shattered their confidence and maybe impacted their career forever. And so I had to take care of the client's interests, obviously, through the court, and then manage two very different sets of feelings from two very different people. And look, we came through it. We amended the pleading. We ended up winning the case. That partner, that associate, and I worked on many things together after that. And yeah, I know I look back at it, and I wasn't a superhero, but I was somebody who had, I think, empathy and a high EQ. And I brought those to bear in that situation. And I like to think we arrived at one of the better possible outcomes.
Sure. And something that you mentioned in some of your interviews is the need to see around corners, and I guess that's a pretty essential skill for a lawyer as well. So how can you use your kind of psychological insights to anticipate potential challenges?
Yeah, I think great question. First of all, um, you know, look, lawyers have to look backwards at precedent and facts, and they have to try to predict the future, right? If we go down path A, this is how this looks. If we go down path B, this is how this looks. Here's the risks of A. Here's the rewards of A. Here's the risks and rewards of B. And you're constantly balancing, and you're absorbing new information, and you're assessing outcomes. A huge part of decision making and path taking is human, right? Yeah, there's a path from a business perspective, but when I have to get on a call with my CEO and he wants to think about, do we go down path A or do we go down path B, or do we acquire this company or do we make this investment? Um, you know, I have to be able to understand what drives him and what motivates him. And so, to my point about seeing around corners, I have to be able to not only understand his current behavior based on his past behavior, I have to predict his future behavior. And I have to understand, you know, if he and I get together in a week, what are the questions he's going to be asking? What is he going to want to know about? You know, I'm not paid by the company to like sit there and tell the CEO or our executive team or our board of directors, teach me how to do my job. I have to be out ahead of it. I talk to my team a lot, and I actually spoke with our board of directors last year. I said, the legal team really serves two functions. We're a coat of armor around the business. So if there's an explosion, we're protected. And also we are almost like a dog who's out ahead of the company sniffing for bombs or landmines, right? And not to diminish, bombs and landmines in human life, but from an analogies perspective, we have to be out there understanding where the business is going and considering potential outcomes long before other people at the company are considering them, right? My CEO looks down the road and he's very forward thinking and he's got an incredible vision strategically. I have to think where he is in my mind, and then 50% beyond that, because I have to think, hey, this is where he wants to go because it serves the business. And then I have to think, okay, well, if we go there, what does that look like 6 months in? What are the risks, right? Or we're a public company. We're going to go public. What are the risks of that? What are the SEC requirements? How do we stay compliant? So again, that's the seeing around corners. You don't have full visibility into a situation, but you have to draw upon your experience and the information you have to make informed, educated decisions. And yeah, I mean, we don't always get it right, but I like to think that my team and I do more often than not. And each time you get it wrong, you're learning a lesson. So.
And I guess finally, as this podcast is, and we've done a good job of covering these topics already throughout the conversation. But as this podcast is about the kind of psychological and human aspects of the legal sector, what are some general principles that have helped you be a more effective lawyer and general counsel?
I think recognizing, so if I think about that first from an inward perspective, I think recognizing when I'm most effective, and I think that's when I'm clear-headed and I'm thinking about things logically and analytically. I'm trying to shut off emotion, anger, disappointment, frustration. Those are distractions to me. So I think a huge part of my psychology education and the human nature of what I do is knowing myself, right? Like, what do I emphasize? What do I lead with? And how does that help me become the most effective version of who I am as an attorney? And then also being willing to understand that I'm going to make mistakes, and each of those mistakes is an opportunity to learn. Other people are going to make mistakes, and it doesn't always mean that because someone made a mistake that they don't care. It may just mean that they didn't get it right this time around. And so I guess if I took all of those concepts and kind of boiled them into one word, we've already talked about empathy. We've already talked about EQ. I think, and this is going to sound a little, kumbaya, but I think kindness and compassion and understanding. I think everyone, if you go into situations assuming everybody's trying to do the best they can, which is not always true, right? And sometimes you learn that lesson the hard way, but I think most people are. If you go into those situations with your walls down and you go into those situations expecting, hey, I'm going to show up, they're going to show up, we're going to have hard conversations, we're going to find a solution, and we're going to work together. I mean, what's more human than that, right, David? Like that's the essence of humanity: relationships, interactions, shared experiences, and just trying to bring the best version of myself to those and lead by example. I find people that I've heard within our business, other people find to be difficult to work with, quite easy to work with. And I don't know if that's because I'm setting an example and they're following that, or if they sense energy and they're like, look, this is a safe place where I can speak openly. I don't have the exact answer to that, but I can just tell you what I bring to these situations. And what I find is generally we get to the right outcome and we do it in a way that is good for all involved. And at the end of the day, for me, it just starts with being kind and being respectful of people. Because at the end of the day, we're all just human beings trying to earn a living. And so, whether I'm the general counsel or a college intern who's going to be here for 12 weeks, everybody has value. Everybody's on their own individual journey, and just stopping and appreciating, your perspective, my perspective aren't the only perspectives in the world goes a long way with people, I think.
Absolutely. Matt, it was great to speak to you, and that was a really interesting conversation. And I think it's really, really nice to have the insight of a general counsel and someone with your kind of career path as well, who's kind of seen all sides of the industry. So thank you very much for joining me.
Yeah, it was my pleasure, David. I really appreciate being here, and I love listening, and I'm going to continue to do so.